In this activity, we're going to learn how to use JavaScript to validate user input before a submit occurs. So go ahead and download the files and code along with me to learn as we go. Here I just have a simple form that has only a couple of inputs and a submit button. When I click on it, it goes to a page that catches that input. So this is a server page that simply tells us what those values were submitted. So what we want to do is initially we've got to stop when this button is clicked. We want to be able to gather input, validate it, and then choose whether to submit or not. So the first thing we're going to do is to learn how not to submit when a button is clicked. So here I've got I've added an event listener that's going to be executed on load, and what I want to do is add an event listener inside here. I'm going to add an event listener on that submit button. So document.getElement by ID, and the ID on that submit button I've set to submit, and I'm going to add an event listener. And I want the event that happens is a click on that button. So click on the submit button, and when that happens, I'm going to call a function validate. All right, now I'm going to go down here outside of this that load function, and I'm going to create the function validate. And in here, one thing that's really interesting is when you have an event and it calls a function, it actually sends the event. So that click event on that specific submit button is sent along, and we can capture that event object by including it as a parameter. So now that I've got that event object, I can call functions that belong to it. So methods that belong to that event object. And one of those is to prevent default. Prevent default. And this is a function, so we need the open and close parens. So we're calling this function that belongs to the event object. And refresh this page, and now when I click that submit, it doesn't do anything. And that's what it's doing. So the standard result of clicking on it, so the default thing that is that it submits the form, but this prevents that default from happening. Now, to make sure that we're actually getting, because really it just looks like nothing's happening, so we want to do a couple things. Make sure we haven't produced an error in the console, and that hasn't happened. Let's go ahead and write something there so we can, I've got a submit message there heading that we can write to. So let's go ahead and do a write to just make sure that we get here, rather than just have that nothing's actually happening. So I'm going to do a document.getElement by ID submit message, and we'll do the inner HTML equals submit was blocked. Okay, and let's save that and refresh, and then click the submit button, and sure enough, so something is happening. It wrote that out for us, and it was prevented from executing. So that's how you can stop a form from submitting. And we're going to want to do that when there's an error. So we're not going to want to do it all the time. So let's go ahead and create a variable that will keep track of if there's an error. So we can say there's a variable error, and we're going to start it out as false. So far there's no error. And then we'll go ahead and surround this code with an if statement that simply says if error. So if error is true, right? So we just say if error, and that's going to be either true or false. If it's true, then we're not going to do this submit, right? Then we'll prevent that default. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Remember that error is false, and so it went ahead and did the submit, right? When it's false, error was false, so If false, it doesn't execute anything in here. If later in the code we set error to true, then when it's tested, that will be true and it will be executed. So let's go ahead and try that. So we click submit, and sure enough, it was blocked. Error was true and it was blocked. So we're going to keep track of this, and what we'll do is whenever we get an error, we'll set it to true. We'll set this variable to true, and that will prevent the submit message from happening. So now that we know how to prevent submit from happening, let's go ahead and work on getting the hashtag and validating it. So to do the hashtag, a hashtag is made up of a pound sign followed by some number of word characters. And in a regular expression, a word character is usually A through Z, uppercase and lowercase, the digits 0 through 9, and the underscore. There's a little variation depending on which specific language you're using, but we'll stick with those really standard ones. So a hashtag, we need a pound sign. So that's going to be that character, and it's going to represent itself. And then we need a word character, and if we check our reference sheet, notice that there's a cheat sheet here in the regex that you can look at, or the regular expression reference sheet that I've listed it. So a \W represents a single word character. So \W. So that's a word character that will allow that A through Z, lowercase or uppercase, 0 through 9, and the underscore. But we want to allow many of them, but we don't know how many. And so this one would just allow one. So we want to go to how do we allow, what can we use for our quantifiers? So if we go to our regular sheet, we can say one or more, which is how many we want, is the plus sign. So we can say we want one or more of those word characters, and we can put it like that. And then here we can test whether, notice that by default the regex pal leaves it global, and that allows it to match wherever it is. It can match multiple occurrences of the pattern. So we can test it, and we can say, hey, football, and that matches. And we can say pound tree, and that matches. And we can say pound 5 walk, and that matches. But now if we do, well, we could do 5 underscore walk, and it still matches. But now if we do add something else, so if we go 5, oops, we have to do the hashtag. Notice it didn't work if we didn't have the hashtag. So it has to start with that pound sign, 5 underscore walk 3, and then we add something that's not a word character, and there we add a punctuation, and it no longer matches. Notice it found the match right here, and since we have the G on, it's letting us find more than one. So if I start here with a question mark, then it doesn't match because it needs at least one or more, so none of it matches, right? So we've done a good job at finding matches that happen, but we haven't done a good job about stopping matches. So notice how we have this one that really isn't a hashtag because it has that question mark in it. Or we might even do something like this. And we've got this string of characters that isn't a hashtag, right? That isn't an official hashtag. It has things both before and after, but we're still showing a match. So if we want to limit the input to only have a hashtag and not have things either before or after it, then we have to assert that the regular expression is at the beginning and the end. So the way we do that is, here's an assert at the end of the string is the $sign. So up here at the very end of my regular expression, I'm going to add the $sign. And I'm going to say this pattern needs to be found at the very end, and we don't have it. Here's the very end, and it's not being found. If we back all the way up, actually we can go this far, and it found one that was right at the very end, right? And the only one that matched is the one that had the pattern right at the end. And that's what that $sign does. It says this pattern happens right at the end of the test string. But we don't want to have 4 hashtags, or we don't want to allow that there can be characters before, or punctuation, or other things that don't count. We want to limit what's before too. And to do that, then we need to assert that the pattern is also found at the beginning. And the character for that is the caret, right? That we can assert that it is at the start of the string. So right there is that caret. Now notice that it doesn't match, and we have to go back to where all we have is a single hashtag, and then it matches. And then if anything shows up before the hashtag, it doesn't match the pattern because it has something else in it. If some punctuation shows up after, then it no longer matches. So we had to make sure that we didn't get additional characters before or after the pattern. We had to both assert that it was at the start and at the end. All right, now we have that pattern, that regular expression. Let's go see how we would use it in our JavaScript. All right, inside our validate function, we're going to get that element, right, get that hashtag and verify it. So first we're going to write down the pattern. So I'm going to create a variable for that regular expression, and I'm going to call it pattern. Maybe I'll just call it hashtag pattern. So this is a variable, and now that we're in JavaScript, we have to start the regular expression with a slash and then write the regular expression. I can't remember if I copied it or not. Let's go back and get it. So once I've got it tested, I want to copy it exactly. So there's the expression that I want to end it with that slash. Now after this I can put flags, and the one that we use the most often is the I, which is ignore case, which means it accepts either uppercase or lowercase matching. But a word character includes uppercase and lowercase, so in this case we do not need the flag. All right, because it allows both uppercase and lowercase letters already. So there's no reason to put the flag, so we'll just finish that. And that's the hashtag pattern. And now we can go get that, the contents of that text box. So I'm going to create a variable for the hashtag. And I'm going to say it's equal to document.getElement by ID, and whatever that ID is on the input text, right, that input text box, the ID is hashtag. And I'm going to get the value, and this gets me the value inside that text box. And now I can ask questions about it. I can say one thing we want to be concerned about is if it's empty, right? So if hashtag is empty, and we can simply do this if it's equal to the empty string, right? So I'm just going to say if it's if it's equal to the empty string, that's a problem. And so I want to do two things. I want to set error equals to true. Notice I'm getting rid of that one that's just out in the middle of nowhere. I only want to set it to true if there's an error. But if they didn't enter anything, that's an error. And then I want to write a message. Now remember that we wrote a message down here. But really, if we're looking at this, instead of writing right here, we want to write a message that's right by the input box, right by that text area. So we need to let them know that hashtag is a required value. So let's go ahead and add, so back in your code after this input element, let's go ahead and add a message, a place where we can put a message. And notice I'm inside a paragraph, so I don't want to use a heading, but so I could just simply use a span because those fit nicely inside a paragraph. And I need to give it an ID, and I'm going to call it hashtag message. All right, and then I can put it in there. So I save that, and then I can go back to the HTML, not the HTML, but go back here, and I can say Okay, we know that there's an error, it's empty, and we can get that message, get element by ID, hashtag message, and we can change the inner HTML to be equal to must enter a value in a value for hashtag. Now this is getting a little long. I can see down here that I'm on column 89, so I'm just going to enter that string below. But must enter a value for hashtag. So let's go ahead and save that and see what happens. When we click submit and it's empty, it comes up and says must enter a value for hashtag. It sets error to true, so when it gets down here and asks if error, sure enough, the submit was blocked. It did that prevent default. So that worked and we got a message by there. Let's go ahead and set that message to a different color that's distinct and maybe bold that a little bit. So we can do that in the style sheet. And all we're doing is we can just set it on the span element, because this is our only span element, and we can say we want color and set that color to something. And let's go ahead and put font weight to bold, and let's see if that stands out a little bit more. So we refresh, it's empty, and we try to submit, and sure enough then we get that error, must enter a value for hashtag. Alright, now we still haven't used our regular expression, right? All we've done is test to make sure there's something in it. So let's go ahead and say, well, if it's not empty, so it gets past that first one, then we'll do an else if, and we'll test our hashtag pattern. And the way that we do this is to call the test function. And the way we do that is we take our pattern, and it's hashtag pattern. Remember up here we defined a variable hashtag pattern, and we say dot test. And that's right, that's a method associated with this pattern object. So then we put in here in the parentheses, we're going to put the actual string. So here we have the pattern, right? That's our pattern, dot test, and then in here we put the string. And what is it? It's this value that we got from the text box, which we stored in this variable hashtag. So there we tested. So pattern dot test, and then the sample string, which was what was entered in the text box. Now, if it finds it, right? So test, if it finds the pattern inside that string, it will return true. And then everything's working great. So we really want to say if it's not true, right? So we have to use a not sign here. So if it doesn't find the pattern, then we want to go in here. And what do we want to do if it doesn't find the pattern? We want to say error equals true, and we want to write in a message. We don't want to write the same message, right? We want to go ahead and write a different message. So now they put something incorrect, it's not empty. There you go. Hashtag must start with # followed by letters, numbers, or underscore. All right, so a different message. And then finally, so if it's not empty and the pattern is found in there, what's the final else? The final else, oh, we don't want a message, right? We don't want to set error to true. And we want the message to go away. So we want there to be no message. And the way we get no message is to set it to empty, right, to an empty string. We just do inner HTML and set it equal to empty, and that will get rid of it. Now notice we don't want to set the error to false, because we're going to be validating a whole bunch of things. So what we want to do is we want to start at false, and then if we get an error anywhere, we set it to true. But in this case, we did not get an error, so we won't set it to true, so it can remain false. So we save that, and we refresh, and they enter a proper hashtag and click submit, and it submitted it. So it validated it, it tested it was not empty, it tested the pattern was in there, so it got rid of the message and error was false. So it didn't do this, which means it didn't prevent it, and the submit happened. Okay, let's do that one more time. You see the pattern? We'll just do it again, right? So let's do it again for the URL. So we need to, what do we need to do? Well, we can get started, right? We can go ahead and in our HTML, there's a couple of things we need to do. We need to add a span so we can write a message. So we'll do a span and we'll give it an ID we can get a hold of. ID equals URL message. So we can do that, and in the JavaScript we can then ask. So notice that this one from right here, we're going to validate hashtag. And then down here, let's go ahead and validate URL. And we don't have a pattern yet, so let's go figure that out. But let's go ahead and do the empty one. All right, so we can say if, we've got to get the element, right? We want to get that value. So let's go ahead and create a variable that is for the URL, and it's going to equal, we're going to go get that element by ID, and we called it, let's see what we called it. The ID is URL. Are you keeping up? Are you doing the coding and it's showing up the same way? And we want to get the value from that text input. All right, so if the URL, the value that's there, if it's equal to the empty string, then we want to write a message. Well, let's make sure we get the error set to true because there was an error. And we want to write the message, document.getElement by ID. And where are we going to write it? We're going to write it to the URL message. And we're going to change the .inner HTML to be equal to a string that says must enter a value for URL. Okay. So let's go ahead and see if that will validate if it's empty or not. So we click save. We refresh. We know we have to put a hashtag in. So let's do that. And then we don't enter a URL and see what happens when we submit. Oh, there it goes. It caught it. If it submit, must enter a value for URL. All right, so now we want to test and see if it matches a pattern. So we need to create a pattern. So we know that in here we can call it URL pattern. But let's go ahead in regexpal and create a pattern, or figure out what the regular expression is for a URL. So what do we know about URLs? We know that a URL starts with HTTP and sometimes an S. So we'll have an H, a TTP, and sometimes an S. So we want to check, and how do we quantify that so it's 0 or 1? So 0, 1 is a question mark. And remember that those quantifiers only go with the last one unless you put in parentheses. So it only applies to the S. So it's going to be HTTP. Each of those are going to happen one time. Then the S is going to happen 0 or 1 time. Then the next character is a /. But notice that we get an underline on here. A / is what we use to end or begin a regular string. So to use it, we have to escape it. We have to use the \, which is the escape character, and then say I want it to actually be a forward slash. So don't make it a personal, or don't make it the special use of a slash, just actually use the slash. So it's https// so we need two of them. So \/ again. All right, then what we need are the characters upper. So the common way, it's actually more complex, but the really common way is uppercase letters, lowercase letters, and not uppercase, lowercase letters, the numeric digits, and the hyphen. So if we say those are the options, we need to put the options inside square brackets. So it can be A to Z, it can be 0 to 9, 0 to 9, or it can be the hyphen. Okay? And notice that we don't have to escape the hyphen because it knows it's not special because it's not between two values. So on its own, it's okay. Now this will only let it be one character, but we want it to be one or more. So we use that plus sign to do the one or more, and then we have the another slash. And then there's not so many rules about what happens in the rest of the string. So let's just make sure that we get this much of the pattern. It starts with HTTP or HTTPS. Oh, we forgot the colon. Remember there's a colon in there. / A through Z, 0 through 9 are a hyphen, and we'll just test that much of it. So let's go ahead and see if we can get some URLs in there. So HTTPS : www.weber.edu/. Oh, something's not quite right. Let's check it out. Oh, we didn't put the dot in there. Now the dot is a special character, so we need to escape it. And there we match. So it can also be a dot. And again, if we don't want to have, we do need to allow things to come after it because that is part of the URL. But we don't want anything to come before the HTTP. So in this case, we're going to let them enter the path and not validate that because that is very unlimited. And there are regular expressions that do that, but we're just going to limit to this much of it being correct. But we do want to assert that it's at the start, and so that it can't have things in front of it before that HTTPS. So there we go with kind of a simple way to test if the URL at least begins correctly. We aren't guaranteed that we would have to have that last slash, right? And it could still work if we're going to an index one. So let's go ahead and put that last slash is also optional. But if it's going to be next if it's going to have more on the path. All right, so now that we've got that string, let's go ahead and write a pattern about it. So in our JavaScript, we're going to create a pattern. Remember, we start it with a slash, put the pattern, and then end it with a slash. We're not going to put the case sensitive flag because it actually is case sensitive. It's just going to be the lower cases. And that's our pattern. And now we can ask the question if it's not empty. So we're going to say else if, and we use our pattern, which is the URL pattern, .test, and then we want to test the string, which is the URL that we got from the input text box. And we want to say, remember, test will return true if the pattern's in there. And so it's a problem if it's not in there, so we put a not. And then once we get in here, we want to set error equal to true, and we want to write a message to the URL message, right? And I want it to say URL must, I'll just put error in URL, and I'll let them look at it and figure out what the error is. Okay, and then finally, If it's not empty and the pattern is in there, then it'll get down to this last else, and in this last else there's no error, so we won't change that, and we will simply instead of writing a message, we'll write the empty string to get rid of any message. All right, so let's see what we've got. So we add a hashtag, and we say enter a URL. If we leave it blank, it requires that we must set it in. And if we do, then if we put something in, http://w, let's just put weber.edu, that should work as well, / and then we click, it got rid of that error message and it went right in. So there we go. It worked. Now let's see if we add something incorrect. So let's go ahead and put something before it, or not do HTTP, let's just do HTTP, and we click submit. It said there's an error in the URL. So here we are validating user input, right? And we don't allow so how does it work? We want to add a click listener to the submit button, and in that click listener we want to create a variable that keeps track of whether there's an error or not, and when we start it's false. And then for each input that we need to validate, if we're validating it with a regular expression, we need to create that expression. We need to get the value from the input element, check to see if it's empty. If it is, set it to true and write a message. We need to check and see if the pattern is in there. If the pattern is not in there, then we set the error to true and write a message. Else, everything's working great, so we just want to write no message, the empty string, and that's what we need to do. And then we do that for every input, and down here we ask the question, if there's an error, and we don't need this message, right? Since we're writing a message by each entry, this bottom one was just for us to test whether something was happening or not. So we don't really need that, but what we want to do is we want to stop it from submitting if there's an error anywhere. And you can go ahead and do lots of validation, so you can validate as many fields as you need to. And if there's an error in any one of them, it will have written a message and stopped the submit from happening.